My mother looked me in the eye and said, "Caleb has vision. You just clock in and clock out." Then she handed him 80% of Grandma's money. I got a box of old quilts and $12,000. That was the moment I stopped being their daughter. My mother looked me dead in the eyes at my grandmother's funeral and said, "Caleb has vision. You just clock in and clock out. You don't need more than that." I was standing in the church parking lot in a black dress I'd bought with my own money, holding a casserole I'd made from Grandma's recipe, and my mother was already carving up the inheritance like a Thanksgiving turkey. I'm Nora. I'm 34. I'm a pediatric nurse, and my family just taught me that the people who are supposed to love you the most can be the ones who see you the least. I grew up in a modest split level in Milwaukee, a suburb just south of Portland. My father, Dennis, worked as an insurance adjuster. My mother, Ruth, was an office manager at a dental practice. We were comfortable, not wealthy, the kind of family where money was always tight but never truly desperate. My older brother, Caleb, was 3 years ahead of me, and he was the axis the entire household spun around. Every fridge magnet was his, every framed photo in the hallway, his face, his trophies. Every dinner table conversation orbited him like he was the sun, and the rest of us were just keeping warm. Caleb played varsity baseball, did community theater, talked about opening a restaurant from the time he was 16. Ruth called him our little entrepreneur. Dennis co-signed his first credit card at 19. When Caleb dropped out of Portland State after 2 semesters to pursue his passion, my parents threw him a going-away dinner. Champagne glasses, a toast, the whole thing. When I graduated nursing school, summa cum laude, Ruth forgot to take the day off work. That was just how it was. You learn to stop expecting things. But my grandmother Phyllis was different. Phyllis Engstrom lived alone near Bend in a small lakeside cabin she and my grandfather Earl had bought back in the 80s. Earl died when I was 9. Phyllis stayed in that cabin for 23 more years because she said the water still sounded like him. Every summer, I spent 2 weeks out there, swimming, reading paperbacks on the dock, learning to make her blueberry buckle from scratch. She never compared me to Caleb, not once. She'd watch me study for my NCLEX exams at her kitchen table and say, "You're the kind of person who holds the world together, Nora. Don't let anyone make you feel small for that." Caleb's first restaurant was a fusion taco bar in the Pearl District. It lasted 14 months and folded with $87,000 in debt. His second was a brunch spot in Lake Oswego, 9 months. Both times, Ruth and Dennis scraped together money, refinanced the house, drained their vacation fund, softened his landing like he was made of glass. Both times, when I said anything, I was told not to make it about me. Then Phyllis got sick. Pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came in the fall, and from that day forward, I drove to Bend every single weekend for 5 months. I bathed my grandmother. I managed her medications. I slept on a fold-out cot 6 inches from her bed so I could hear her breathing in the dark. Caleb visited twice. He brought flowers both times and left within the hour. She died in March. The funeral was on a Tuesday, and before the dirt had even settled, my parents were whispering with Caleb near the coat rack about the cabin. I heard my mother say, "Mom would have wanted Caleb to have the space for his next chapter." I had spent 5 months driving 3 hours round trip to that cabin every weekend, and nobody once asked what Grandma might have wanted for me. 2 weeks later, Dennis called a family meeting at the house in Milwaukee. He and Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. They laid it out plain. Phyllis had left behind the cabin near Bend and $278,000 in savings. Dennis announced, not proposed, announced that Caleb would receive the cabin and $222,400, 80%, for his third restaurant concept, some farm-to-table place he wanted to open in the Alberta Arts District. My share was $12,000 and a box of Grandma's handmade quilts. "You're practical, Nora," Ruth said with a thin smile. "You don't need more than that." I sat there with my hands in my lap, feeling that familiar shrinking sensation I'd known my whole life, that quiet collapsing. But something was different this time. Phyllis was gone, and the last person who had ever made me feel seen in that family was no longer sitting at the table. I looked at the box of quilts in the corner. I thought about the woman who'd stitched every one of them, and something hardened inside my chest. Something that wasn't going to shrink back down. What none of them knew, not my parents, not Caleb, not anyone sitting at that kitchen table, was that Grandma Phyllis had already made her own plan, and she'd made it long before any of them started dividing up her life. 3 days after that kitchen table meeting, a certified letter arrived at my apartment in Southeast Portland. The return address was a law office in Bend. Okafor and Lindgren, attorneys at law. I'd never heard of them. I almost tossed it with the junk mail, but something told me to open it. So I did, standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of cold coffee in my other hand. The letter was from Janet Okafor, an estate attorney who explained that my grandmother, Phyllis Engstrom, had established a revocable living trust in August, 2 full years before she died. I was the sole beneficiary. The trust contained $193,500 held in a separate brokerage account that Phyllis had quietly funded over the course of a decade. Small transfers, dividend reinvestments, money she had kept entirely separate from the accounts my parents knew about. Money nobody at that kitchen table had any idea existed. Inside the envelope, tucked behind the legal documents, was a handwritten note on lavender stationery. I recognized Grandma's handwriting immediately. The slight leftward slant. The way she always pressed too hard on the pen. Nora, honey, I watched you your whole life, giving everything and being handed scraps. This is yours. Not because you need rescuing, but because someone should have told you a long time ago that you deserve more than leftovers. Don't let them take this from you. I love you to the dock and back. Grandma. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I cried for 40 minutes. Not sad crying. Not angry crying. The kind of crying that happens when someone finally sees the thing you've been carrying alone for years and says it out loud. Even from the grave, Phyllis Engstrom was the only person in my family who had ever really looked at me. I told no one, not for months. I went to work. I did my shifts. I kept my mouth shut. And for 5 months, I watched from a distance as Caleb opened his 3rd restaurant in the Alberta Arts District. He called it Terroir, farm to table, reclaimed wood tables, and $16 cocktails. It opened to modest fanfare, and then bled money for 22 straight weeks before closing permanently. $222,000. Gone. Dennis called me on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting on my couch eating leftover soup. Nora, we need to talk about Caleb's situation. The restaurant didn't work out. I'm sorry to hear that, Dad. I really am. Your mother and I have been talking, and we know about Grandma's trust. Janet Okafor's office contacted us when we filed the probate paperwork. We need you to share that money with your brother. He's drowning, Nora. He's drowning because you and Mom kept throwing him into the deep end and calling it swimming. That money was Grandma's decision. She left it to me. She was confused at the end. She didn't know what she was doing. Your mother is devastated. She thinks you've been hiding this from us on purpose. Grandma set that trust up 2 years before she got sick, Dad. She wasn't confused. She was the clearest thinker in this family. He hung up on me. Within an hour, Ruth had sent a group text to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, every last one of them. The message said I had manipulated a dying woman into secretly funneling money away from the family. My phone lit up. Aunt Brenda called me selfish. My cousin Marcus said I should do the right thing. Not a single person asked for my side of the story. Not one. I turned my phone off. I sat in the dark for a long time. And then I did something I had never done before in my entire life. I decided not to fold. I was not going to explain myself. I was not going to apologize. I was not going to hand over a single cent of the money my grandmother had specifically, deliberately, and legally set aside for me. I thought about Phyllis in the dock at sunset, her white hair blowing sideways, saying, "Don't let them make you feel small for that." I opened my laptop and started looking for a lawyer. The next morning, I told Darren Matsuda. Darren worked the same pediatric ward as me at Dornbecker Children's Hospital. He was a nurse now, but before nursing school, he'd spent 4 years as a paralegal at a trusts and estates firm in Salem. I trusted him. Over coffee in the break room, I told him everything. He didn't even blink. A revocable living trust that was funded and executed 2 years before death with a licensed attorney as trustee? Nora, that's about as bulletproof as it gets. They can threaten whatever they want. They've got nothing. He helped me pull the relevant Oregon statutes. He reviewed the trust documents line by line. He told me to retain my own attorney just to have formal representation on file. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought they'd bluster and then back down the way people do when they know they're wrong but don't want to admit it. 2 weeks later, a process server showed up at my apartment door with a manila envelope. My own parents were suing me in Deschutes County Probate Court to invalidate Grandma's trust and seize every dollar she'd left me. I hired a probate litigator named Grace Wilder. She worked out of a small firm in Bend that Darren's former colleagues had recommended. Grace was in her mid-40s, direct, no wasted words. The kind of lawyer who reads the whole file before the first phone call. When I sat across from her and told her everything, she nodded once and said, "They don't have a case, but let's make sure they know it." Grace pulled the full trust documentation, the original instrument, signed and notarized in August, 2 full years before Phyllis's diagnosis. Medical records from Grandma's primary care physician confirming full cognitive capacity at the time of signing. And then, the thing that changed everything. Janet Okafor, Grandma's attorney, had kept meticulous file notes from every single meeting with Phyllis, every conversation, every decision. But she'd also done something else. She had recorded a video statement. Phyllis, sitting in Janet's office, looking directly into the camera, explaining clearly and calmly why she was creating the trust and why she was naming me. I watched that video in Grace's office on a Thursday afternoon. Grandma was wearing her blue cardigan, the one with the loose button on the left cuff. She looked healthy. She looked sharp. She said, "I love my daughter Ruth, but she and Dennis have spent 30 years pouring everything into Caleb and treating Nora like she's invisible. I'm not going to let that be the last word." I had to pause the video and step outside for air. Grace also pulled the bank records. The trust account had been funded over 10 years. Small, consistent transfers. $20 here, $50 there. Dividend reinvestments that compounded quietly in the background. This was not a deathbed impulse. This was a decade of deliberate, careful planning by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Darren helped me build a timeline. Every weekend I'd driven to Bend during those 5 months. Every medication I'd administered. Every night on that fold-out cot. Then Caleb's column. 2 visits. Flowers. Under an hour each time. If anyone had manipulated a vulnerable woman, the evidence pointed in the opposite direction of what my parents were claiming. 3 of Phyllis's neighbors in Bend submitted written statements. Donna Greer, Hank Castellano, Margaret Liu. All 3 confirmed that Phyllis had spoken openly about me being the one who actually shows up. Margaret's statement included a direct quote. Phyllis had told her, "Ruth and Dennis give everything to the boy and nothing to the girl. I'm going to fix that." My parents hired a cut-rate attorney named Victor Slade. He filed a motion arguing undue influence and diminished capacity. Grace read it and almost laughed. The motion cited no medical evidence, no witness testimony. It relied almost entirely on the argument that Phyllis would not have excluded her own son's family unless she'd been coerced. Grace called it a tantrum dressed in legalese. I thought that was generous. Caleb went a different route. He launched a social media campaign, Facebook posts, Instagram stories. He wrote about being betrayed by my own sister, painted himself as a hard-working entrepreneur, sabotaged by family dysfunction. He never mentioned the $222,000 he'd already burned through. Mutual friends started taking sides. I lost 2 friendships I'd had since high school. People who believed Caleb's version without ever picking up the phone and calling me. Then Ruth escalated. She called OHSU Nursing Administration, my workplace. She told them she had concerns about Nora's emotional stability. My charge nurse, Linda Huang, flagged it and quietly pulled me aside. No action was taken. But I stood in that hallway and realized something. My family wasn't just fighting over money anymore. They were trying to take apart my life, piece by piece. Grace filed a motion to dismiss. She attached the video statement, the medical records, the bank transfer history, the neighbor declarations. She also filed a counter motion requesting that Ruth and Dennis be ordered to pay my legal fees if the court found their claim frivolous. Darren told me not to respond to any of Caleb's posts. The court doesn't care about Instagram, he said. Let him talk. Your evidence speaks in a courtroom, not a comment section. So I kept my head down. I went to work. I took care of my patients. I let the case speak for itself. Grace subpoenaed Janet Okafor to testify in person. Janet had been Phyllis's attorney for 11 years. She ran her practice out of a converted Victorian house on Greenwood Avenue in Bend. Soft-spoken, late 50s, meticulous. When Grace contacted her about the lawsuit, Janet wasn't surprised. "Phyllis told me this would happen," she said. "She told me her daughter and son-in-law would try to take the money. She said, 'Janet, you make sure they can't.' And I did." Her records were airtight. Her testimony was going to be devastating. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in Deschutes County Courthouse. I drove to Bend the night before and stayed in a motel 6 miles from Grandma's cabin. The cabin my parents had already signed over to Caleb. The cabin where I'd spent every summer of my childhood, learning what it felt like to be enough. The courtroom in Deschutes County was small and fluorescent lit. Wood-paneled walls, an American flag drooping in the corner. I sat next to Grace Wilder on the left side, my hands flat on the table so nobody could see them shaking. Across the aisle, Ruth, Dennis, and Caleb sat behind Victor Slade, who was shuffling papers like a man looking for an answer he'd never written down. Janet Okafor was already seated in the gallery with a leather binder in her lap. Judge Patricia Herrera reviewed the filings. She asked Victor Slade to present the basis for his claim. He talked for about 6 minutes. He argued that Phyllis had been emotionally dependent on me, and that the trust represented a pattern of coercive control. He had no medical testimony, no expert witness, nothing but his client's belief that they deserved the money because they wanted it. Grace stood. She played 30 seconds of Phyllis's video statement. Grandma appeared on the screen in her blue cardigan. Her eyes were sharp, clear. She looked directly into the camera and said, "I am making this trust because my granddaughter Nora has been treated as less than her entire life by her own parents. I love my daughter Ruth, but I will not let her repeat with my money what she's done with her attention. Nora gets this because Nora earned it, not by asking, but by showing up when nobody else did." The courtroom went silent. Ruth's face crumbled. Dennis stared at his shoes. Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, like he was waiting for it to open up and swallow him. Judge Herrera dismissed the case in 17 minutes. She called the filing without evidentiary merit and granted Grace's motion for legal fees, ordering Ruth and Dennis to pay $4,200 in attorney costs. 17 minutes. My parents spent more time planning Caleb's going away dinner. As I walked out of the courtroom, Caleb caught my arm in the hallway. "You could have just helped me, Nora. That's all I ever asked." I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see the golden child. I saw a 37-year-old man with restaurant grease under his fingernails and nothing in his bank account, still waiting for someone else to fix it. "No, Caleb, you asked me to be less so you could be more. That's all anyone in this family ever asked me." I walked out into the Oregon sun, and I didn't look back. Caleb's restaurant debt eventually settled at 41 cents on the dollar after his attorney negotiated with creditors. He took a job at a car wash on Powell Boulevard in southeast Portland, not by choice. His credit was destroyed, and nobody in the restaurant industry would touch him. Ruth and Dennis paid my legal fees, but never acknowledged the court's ruling. They told the extended family the judge had been biased and that I'd hired a shark lawyer. Aunt Brenda stopped speaking to me entirely. Cousin Marcus sent one text. "I hope you're happy." I didn't respond. The social media posts quietly disappeared. The family group chat went silent. 8 months passed without a single word from Ruth or Dennis. My phone didn't ring on my birthday. It didn't ring on Christmas. The silence hurt more than the lawsuit ever had. But it also felt, for the first time in my life, honest. On a rainy Sunday in November, Ruth left a voicemail. Her voice was thin, halting. "Nora, it's your mother. I'm not calling to apologize. I still think you could have handled things differently. But your father's blood pressure has been bad, and I just think families shouldn't be like this. If you want to come for Thanksgiving, the door's open." I listened to that voicemail twice. I didn't call back that day. I didn't call back the next day either. I sat on the porch of my new house and watched the rain fall on the lake and thought about it for a long time. I wasn't ready. Maybe someday, but not yet. I used part of the trust money as a down payment on a small 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Bend, 12 minutes from the lake where Grandma's cabin sat. I didn't buy the cabin. Caleb still technically owned it, though he never visited and the place was slowly falling apart. I didn't need the cabin. I needed to be near the water, where I'd felt most like myself. I hung Phyllis's quilts on the walls. I put the lavender letter in a frame above the fireplace. I kept working at Dornbecker, driving the 3 hours to Portland for my shifts and staying with Darren and his wife Keiko on weekdays. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a restructured life. Smaller, quieter, built entirely on ground that nobody could pull out from under me. People ask me if I feel guilty. I don't. I feel sad. Sad that my parents couldn't love 2 children at once. Sad that my brother never learned that the world doesn't owe you a 3rd chance just because you've got a dream. But I don't feel guilty. My grandmother saw me when nobody else did. She planned for the moment when I'd need proof that someone in my family believed I was worth something. And she made sure that proof was waiting for me. Signed, notarized, unbreakable. I love you to the dock and back, Grandma. Always.